Star compass. Even with the compensation for polarized light, a sun compass would be useless to animals who navigate during the night. An obvious way to deal with this is to use stellar constellations, the organization of stars, as directional cues. Emlyn, 1970, tested for a star compass in indigo buntings, Passerina cyanae, that were reared in captivity with a normal light-dark cycle, but different exposure to the nighttime sky. Those that never saw the star constellations showed restlessness at the time of migration, but no preferred direction of travel. Two other groups were housed in a planetarium where they had exposure to star configurations that were artificially manipulated. One viewed the normal rotation of stars around the north-south axis, whereas the second group viewed a configuration that rotated around the east-west axis, i.e. abnormal. When the migratory season arrived, the first group showed a southerly, i.e. correct, direction of travel, but the second group did not. This star compass navigation appears to me limited to birds that use the axis of star rotation as a reference for north-south directions. Unlike a sun compass, orientation to stars is not time compensated, and it may be important only in migration, i.e. not in small-scale navigation or homing. Humans can also orient using star constellations. In previous centuries, this information was used to navigate across large bodies of open water. Unlike birds, however, star compass use in humans is acquired, primarily, through the transmission of knowledge within a community. Magnetic cues. In addition to celestial cues, both the sun and stars, migrating and homing animals, may use variations in the Earth's magnetic field as a directional cue. This idea became popular when it was shown that pigeons carrying small coils that distort the Earth's magnetic field had difficulty homing. Bird migration is also affected by magnetic fields. The orientation of migratory restlessness in lab-reared birds matches the Earth's magnetic field, and this preferred direction of travel can be altered by simulating a shift in the magnetic field surrounding a cage. Similar experiments revealed that honeybees, American cockroaches, California spiny lobsters, common mole rats, and big brown bats are able to detect changes in magnetic field direction, although these processes have been studied far less frequently than in birds. Magnetic cues may be particularly important for marine animals because ocean environments are altered significantly across seasons and weather patterns. Moreover, celestial cues, including polarized light, are only available to animals that remain at or near the water surface. The best evidence for magnetic field detection by migrating marine animals comes from an experiment with loggerhead sea turtles, Caretta caretta. Animals were tethered in a large pool filled with seawater so that their preferred direction of travel could be recorded. The underlying magnetic field was altered by a large magnetic coil surrounding the pool. Turtles swam in a direction predicted by the magnetic field. If the field indicated that they were north of their migration site, they oriented south, but if the field was set up to mimic magnetic fields that would occur south of their destination, the turtle swam north. The importance of magnetic cues in the natural environment was confirmed in an experiment that placed disrupting coils on the heads of green sea turtles during homing, and in an observational study that tracked humpback whales during migration. Many other reports provided evidence that animals, primarily birds and turtles, use magnetic field information during large-scale navigation, but the interpretation of these results is not straightforward. For example, although the initial orientation of homing pigeons is disrupted by magnetic coils, the birds still find their way home. Recent technological advances, such as satellite tracking, showed that navigation sometimes remains intact in sea turtles and migrating birds fitted with disturbance magnets. A further paradox is that chum salmon and rainbow trout can detect magnetic fields, but orientation to these cues does not appear to influence ocean navigation. Even simulated magnetic displacement does not produce consistent effects on navigation, or at least not effects that are predicted by the Earth's magnetic field. A possible resolution to these contradictions is that magnetic maps, like a star compass, may be used to derive north-south coordinates during initial orientation, but that other mechanisms take over once animals are heading in the correct direction. Olfactory cues. The fourth and final mechanism of large-scale navigation, orientation to olfactory cues, is the most controversial. The idea, put forward to explain pigeon homing, Pappy et al., 1972, suggests that birds learn how different atmospheric gases are spatially distributed at their loft. When they are released from a novel location, they detect the proportion of different gases being carried on the wind and fly in a direction that maximizes the similarities between odor profiles at their current location and at their home. The olfactory hypothesis is supported by evidence that blocking olfactory input in pigeons disrupts homing, although these results, and later ones reporting similar effects, were criticized because manipulations, e.g. lesions, often produce other deficits. Critics also pointed out that atmospheric odors are unstable, so could not be used as reliable navigational cues. In response, Walraff, 2004, showed that the relationship between atmospheric gases, although not their absolute levels, remains constant within an environment. Moreover, introducing false odors at an unfamiliar release site fools birds into flying in the wrong direction. A consensus is now emerging that homing pigeons, as well as some other bird species, may use olfactory cues during navigation, although it is unlikely that this mechanism plays a major role in migration. The fact that disrupting olfactory input only affects homing when birds are released from unfamiliar sites suggests that they revert to using other cues, e.g. visual landmarks, when these are available. The other well-documented instance of olfactory cue use during navigation is natal homing of Pacific coho salmon. It is still not clear how these fish find their natal river from distant ocean sites. The best guess is that they use a sun and/or magnetic compass. Once they reach the river mouth, however, they swim upstream and locate the spawning ground using chemical cues. This process resembles imprinting, in that salmon exposed to specific olfactory cues during development will return to breed in streams artificially scented with these chemicals. It is still not clear where the olfactory cues are coming from that salmon respond to. Aquatic plants and odors emitted from conspecifics are two of the most likely candidates. The mechanisms that determine which direction to travel during large-scale navigation, e.g. sun, star, magnetic, and olfactory cues, are not the same as those that signal where to stop. In most migrating species, the termination of long-distance travel occurs through a genetic program that keeps track of travel time. This was demonstrated initially in a lab study using European blackcaps from different parts of Europe. The length of migratory restlessness mapped onto the migratory distance of each population. In other words, birds that had longer migratory routes spent more time in Zagunra. The same phenomenon is present in other migratory species. It is still not clear whether this internal clock is signaling how long the animal has been traveling, or when its energy reserves are depleted, or both. Regardless, if speed and direction of travel remain relatively constant across seasons, either calculation will place animals at their final destination, or at least close enough that they can then rely on familiar landmarks to locate their habitat. Role of experience. The previous section provides compelling evidence for endogenous control of large-scale navigation, but experience also has a profound effect on this behavior. Indeed, the discussion of olfactory cue use emphasized that animals, at least pigeons and salmon, rely on previously acquired information to return home. Learned cues may be less important during the initial stages of homing, particularly if animals are released from an unfamiliar site. Once they reach the home vicinity, however, they appear to navigate using familiar sensory cues. For many years, migration was considered to be different from homing in that it was supposedly due entirely to inherited factors. Opinions began to change in the mid-20th century, in the mid-1900s, with a classic translocation experiment in which thousands of European starlings were displaced from the Netherlands to Switzerland prior to migration, per dec. 1958. When released, first-time migrants traveled in a direction and over a distance that would have taken them to their wintering home in Spain. That is, they made no compensation for their displacement. See Figure 5.14. In contrast, second-year migrants flew in the right direction to reach their southerly habitat, even though they had no experience with the Swiss landscape prior to departure. Figure 5.14. Results of a translocation experiment in which European starlings were displaced from the Netherlands to Switzerland prior to migration. Arrows indicate flight patterns of first-time and second-year migrants. Okay, so it's a map of part of Europe, and then you can see that the displacement occurred when the birds were taken from the Netherlands to Switzerland, and then they were trying to fly to England for the winter. So their usual migration route would be west-southwest from the Netherlands to England. So now they went south and a little bit east to Switzerland. So the recovered adults, the second-year migrants, were able to fly in a new direction and distance to reach England, so that now they're flying northwest, whereas the recovered juveniles, the first-time migrants, they still flew the same pattern as before, southwest, and so they were not near the correct location. Now they're way too far south. The experiment has been repeated with different avian species in other parts of the world, often with mixed results. Some first-time migrants compensate for displacement, both when they are moved by an experimenter and when they are set off course by natural elements such as wind patterns. The distinction between birds that do and birds that do not adjust their migratory routes when they are moved may reflect species differences or specific environmental conditions at the capture and release sites. However, even if first-time migrants perform better than originally suggested, they are consistently worse at finding their way than our older conspecifics. The current challenge is to identify why this occurs. Some suggest that migrating birds acquire information about magnetic fields, wind patterns, or landscape topography, which they use as orientation cues on subsequent voyages, but to date, there is no convincing evidence for either hypothesis. Still, there is little disagreement that migratory experience facilitates later navigation. Conservationists capitalize on this fact in their efforts to protect endangered species. See Box 5.3. Box 5.3, Migration and Conservation. Humans have been interested in animal migration since the beginning of civilization. In the past, they used this information to hunt effectively, to avoid being hunted, and to locate natural resources such as water and fertile land. Now, many people are studying migratory patterns in an effort to protect species whose numbers are rapidly declining due to human activity. One of the most devastating is habitat destruction that comes with increasing urban sprawl and industrialization. Even attempts at environmentally friendly changes, e.g. windmills, may impact certain species by disrupting migration routes and creating noise pollution for animals with highly developed auditory systems. Not surprisingly, global warming is severely disrupting migratory patterns as animals may return to seasonal habitats that are no longer ideal for breeding, feeding, or rearing young. Walrus migration is a prime example. These animals leave land habitats in the far north to breed on more southerly located ice floes. Due to rising ocean temperatures, ice floes are rapidly disappearing, which is inhibiting walrus reproduction in certain areas. Despite these pessimistic reports, the survival challenges facing contemporary species are not new. All living animals are proof that their ancestors were able to adapt to altered environmental conditions, even if these occurred within a short period of time. For example, migrating birds would have arrived in temperate regions after the last ice age, approximately 10,000 years ago. This suggests a relatively rapid evolution of migration routes, a phenomenon that has accelerated in many parts of the world during the last 50 years. Berthold and colleagues, 1992, documented this change in blackcaps from the Arctic that began wintering in southern Britain in the 1950s. The numbers increased dramatically over the next half-century, next 50 years, suggesting that habitat had favored a novel migratory route that took birds to a habitat approximately 1,500 kilometers north of their previous destination. Selective breeding verified that genetic variation could account for this behavioral change and confirmed that phenotypic variability in migratory behaviors is inherited. At least for blackcaps, natural selection has helped these birds to adapt to rapidly changing habitats. Scientists are working hard to understand both the extensions and limitations of this behavioral flexibility. Ideally, this information could be used to facilitate shifts in bird migratory patterns in anticipation of changing environmental conditions. These efforts have been facilitated by modern tracking technologies that allow researchers to record changes in migration routes with greater precision. Knowing where and when animals will travel can be critical for species protection. As an example, the Institute for Environmental Monitoring and Research in Quebec, Canada, has been tracking migratory caribou since 1991 and using this information to develop policy statements on the operation and construction of hydroelectric dams in northern Canada. Similar discussions of animal conservation often extend to the international level. Animal migration does not respect political boundaries, so animals that are protected in one part of the world may be actively hunted in others. In an attempt to reduce this practice, environmental groups frequently lobby governments or provide educational material on animal conservation to local agencies in the targeted area. In rare instances, some migrating bird species have been trained to follow light aircraft as a means to avoid inhospitable migration routes or destinations. OperationMigration.org. Notwithstanding these measures, it is clear that many species will not adapt to the changing environment. For those that do, it is likely to be a very different world. Synthesis of mechanisms. In most species, large-scale navigation is controlled by more than one process. This provides greater precision in reaching the target destination and also allows animals to adjust to current conditions, such as weather or geographical location. A large-scale tracking study verified that humpback whales use a combination of sun, star, and magnetic cues during migration, and that none of these in isolation can explain the accuracy of navigation by these animals. Importantly, experience may shift the control of navigation from one mechanism to another. For example, migrating birds orient using magnetic cues if they have not been exposed to the movement of the sun across the sky. With this experience, however, a sun compass becomes predominant and birds only revert to using magnetic cues if the sun is not visible. Similarly, homing pigeons with more experience navigating under cloud cover show better accuracy in returning home, probably because they have learned to rely on magnetic cues when necessary. Given that animals can use different cues during large-scale navigation, the current challenge is to understand when and how these work together. Some researchers propose a sequential model in which different mechanisms guide behavior depending on the stage of a journey. In support of this idea, magnetic coils attached to the heads of green turtles disrupted navigation only when animals were 4 to 50 kilometers from their home. Thus, although turtles can detect and respond to geomagnetic cues, they only use these during the middle stages of large-scale navigation, a finding that may explain contradictory evidence from previous experiments. Salmon homing appears to fit the same model. One process, that has yet to be identified, guides fish to the river mouth, the point at which olfactory cues from the spawning site take over. Similar models are being developed for migration, although the huge variability in migratory patterns, both within and between species, makes it difficult to provide a comprehensive analysis of this behavior. Finally, any model of large-scale navigation must describe how this process relates to small-scale navigation. According to some researchers, the two processes represent the same underlying phenomenon, even if they support different behaviors, e.g. caching versus migration. A similar idea was put forward by the renowned ornithologist Grinnell, who proposed that migratory adaptations are rather simple extensions of spatial behaviors that animals exhibit on a daily basis. Grinnell, 1931. Others note that the mechanisms mediating small-scale navigation may have evolved to support large-scale navigation and vice versa, but there is no way to distinguish between the two. From a theoretical perspective, both functional and mechanistic explanations of small and large-scale navigation are likely to overlap. The separation of the two probably relates to the difficulty of studying the two processes simultaneously.